Hey guys, so before you take the mini quiz today, I just wanted to go over a few things. Some of them are reminders from what we've talked about, and one new thing that we need to be aware of. So I'll start with the new thing. The new thing is just called rationalizing the denominator. Oops. Denominator. And when we work with square roots in math, we do not like to have square roots on the bottom of a fraction. So we would not want to see a fraction where it's something like this. We don't like square roots on the bottom. So what we do is we rationalize the denominator, and we make it so that there's not a square root on the bottom. So what I mean by that is this. Say we have something like the square root of 9 over 13. Like we've talked about, we can use the quotient rule, and we can make that the square root of 9 over the square root of 13. The square root of 9 is just 3. And square root of 13, we cannot break that down anymore. There aren't any perfect squares that go into 13 that we can multiply together to get 13. So this is where we rationalize the denominator. And all that means is that we're going to get the square root of 13 out of the denominator. So what we do is we multiply it by square root of 13 over square root of 13, because we know that anything over itself, like 4 over 4, is just equal to 1. And when we multiply something by 1, it doesn't affect the actual outcome or the actual value of whatever this original number is. So essentially what we're doing here is just multiplying it by 1 in the form of square root of 13 over square root of 13. Now, what that does in our answer, well, 3 times the square root of 13, that's all good. Now, what we talked about yesterday, and hopefully you're getting a good feel for, is that anytime we do a square root of something times the square root of the same thing, then it would be just that number. So square root of x times the square root of x would just give us x. So when we do the square root of 13 times the square root of 13, that would just give us 13 on the bottom. So rationalizing the denominator sounds like a really complicated term, but all that it means is that we're getting that square root out of the bottom, and then eventually it will end up being on top, but we do that by multiplying by 1 in a sense. Now, if it were something like 3 over the square root of 2 13ths, then we could still multiply by 2 over 13, 2 square roots of 13. 3 times 2 is 6, square root of 13 over, this would be a little bit tricky, 4 times the square root of 13. So we still could do it. We have to simplify this a little bit, and we may have to simplify our whole fraction, but it gets a little more tricky if there's a whole number in front. So that's the first thing. That's the new thing. You're going to have to do that on the quiz. On the quiz, it'll say, or quote-unquote quiz, it will say, hey, make sure that there are no square roots in the denominator. So that means we're going to have to rationalize it like I just showed. The other thing that I just want to remind you of is multiplying by square roots. So the rule that we have right now, we can say when we have x times y under a square root, that's the same as x square root of x times square root of y. That's our product rule. That's the very first thing we learned on Monday. On the converse of that, or the opposite, that backwards, would be the square root of x times the square root of y. We can rewrite that as x times y. So what that looks like in a problem is if we are multiplying two square roots. What if it says square root of 2 times the square root of 10? Well, we can rewrite that as 2 times 10, which would be the square root of 20. But now we need to look at the square root of 20 and say, okay, can we break this down even more? Do one of my perfect squares go into it? And we know that 5 times 4 is 20. So we can rewrite this then as the square root of 4, or the square root of 4 times 5. And we would end up rewriting it and simplifying it all the way down to 2 square roots of 5. So if they start out with something like this, or even if there's a bunch of numbers in there, but we're eventually multiplying with those square roots, we need to work backwards or use our product rule kind of in the opposite direction. And then once we get our new square root, we need to say, okay, can I break this down? now is it in a form that I can adjust it? And if so, we continue and do that. And if not, then we would stop right here. So those are the two things that I wanted to point out before you take this mini quiz. If you're not understanding those two things, then just maybe send me an email before you take the quiz and we can talk about it a little bit. But if you're good to go on what we've talked about so far and understand this idea of rationalizing the denominator and how we work backwards with the product rule, which we've done before, this was on the homework. But if you're comfortable with those, then you should be all good to go on the mini quiz. All right, that's all I have for right now. Again, if you have any questions, make sure you send me an email and we'll talk to you guys soon.